Good evening and welcome to Zion's Banner. We didn't think we were going to make it tonight. Some storms came through Phoenix and knocked power out. God's timing was absolutely perfect. We were getting ready to leave the house to come to where we do the taping, and sure enough, the power came back on. You might not think that's too important, but I use a sleep apnea machine, and I sleep a lot better when it's cooler. So I'm kind of excited about hopefully the power staying on the rest of the night and God's perfect timing. This is going to be part of a two-part series. I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute or two, but I want to give you our little promo. We haven't seen as many people on visiting the website or visiting our page. We want you to check out our website. Admittedly, a lot of these are not on there yet. This one I hope to get on before some of the other ones. We're taping on Facebook, and we're also taping by live camera, and so I'm a little bit behind. You may ask why. Because we're in a season of support raise, and so it is terribly important that you think about partnering with us. Everything we do, we put on there for free. But the reality is I've got to take the time to go ahead and build our team. And so I welcome you to be a part of that team. You can have a part in reaching people by making much of Messiah through God's big story by means of teaching and apologetics. And so I hope you'll consider that as you're there. If you already are, or you're just friends of ours and you're our prayer support, we deeply appreciate you. But we've let that promo go through enough, and you know where to find us. So in a sense, you know where we live. No real updates. We are planning to get to California. I'm actually reserving parts of the messages that I could be doing here to actually tape in California. And the person who tapes us actually is putting in a request for certain messages that he wants to see me put together. And we're shooting for that in August, about the time my daughter comes home from Ecuador, where she's been doing a short-term missions trip. In the meantime, I actually have the honor, a shout out to Meadows Southern Baptist, to be there on a Sunday morning, and so that's where I'll be when you don't find me at Hillside. Well, let's get started on our PowerPoint. I haven't been putting these up as much because hopefully you're tuning in. And if you tune in at all, even if you see it as a rerun, you can see the PowerPoint. If you want that PowerPoint, just text or do something or go to our site or leave a comment. Or there are a lot of ways to do that. We want to make those available to you. We've done it a little less because we've been integrating the PowerPoints in the presentations. But there may still be a desire to have those. If I put them on, they have to be in PDF. Our website does not allow PowerPoints in a native Microsoft Office format. So we are interested in doing that, but we're also interested in seeing how much interest there is. If you're seeing these as part of the broadcast, you may not want to see them again, or you may want them as a resource. And so you're free to give us feedback through the various means as you find us on Facebook and as you find us on the website. You will have contact information. So you can see the sign up there, can't you? Because the PowerPoint's already up there. I like the way it's juxtaposition. We're going to be dealing with whether the New Testament is Jewish. We're going to deal with it in two sections. Part 2 that we'll be doing will be told more about you at the end. I've got a slide up, and I'm going to tell you what we're doing and why we're doing it. That may be the week after this, or we may end up skipping a week to put some of the material on the website. So please be paying attention for announcements. I'll have info up there. So you need to be looking for that. Because we may have a little bit of a delay here because we've gotten a little backlogged. My desire would be to go ahead and broadcast anyway, and my lovely wife should be with me on that night. Tonight, she's busy helping at VBS. So let's talk about whether the New Testament is Jewish, and let's look at that. Why is that important even to begin with? Because one of the arguments against the gospel is that the New Testament is actually an anti-Semitic book that is not Jewish. So we're going to take that apart. I'm not the first person to deal with. Believe me, Dr. Brown has several areas in his Jewish objections that deal with that. But is it worth dealing with again and getting out there that information out in yet another form? Yes. Is it going to be interesting to juxtaposition in this the way I end up dealing with the argument? Now, Dr. Brown has some of the same information, but he hasn't necessarily lined it up according to the same points. And I think this is a pretty good presentation, especially in two parts. By the way, in the second part, I'll actually be making use of a paper that I wrote for the Feinberg program when I was doing my MDiv. So it's kind of fun for me to be able to use that material. Let's get started here. I put a subsection under that, understanding intersectarian dialogue. And no, I'm not talking about insect dialogue. We're not talking about beetles and grasshoppers. Sects refers to the types or varieties of Judaism that existed, and they communicated amongst each other. And that's what we mean by intersectarian dialogue, because there were Pharisees and Sadducees and all sorts of different groups, and they all communicated with each other. And what we're going to see, maybe not so much tonight, but in the near future, is they didn't always communicate so nicely. And it forms part of the background of things. So let me go ahead. Yes, there were different Judaisms. Now, I didn't borrow this term Judaisms. Actually, this is borrowed from another scholar who talked about Judaisms. Jewish people don't talk about Judaisms. They actually talk about branches of Judaism. If you go further back and you look at historical information and scholarship, they'll talk about varieties of Judaism or sects of Judaism. But in a very way, these were they had things in common, but they could be not in a lot of agreement in some other areas. And so I like to use the term Judaisms, and I like borrowing that term because really we need to understand that there was a lot of variety. Judaism of the Second Temple era was not monolithic. By the way, Jewish people, one, sometimes are historically very unaware of this, and two, sometimes they'll make out as though Judaism as a religion is really quite monolithic, and they'll talk about Christianity being very divided. But the reality is that in the Second Temple period, there was a great deal of latitude that ended up existing there. Now, how do I know there were different sects? Now, I don't often pull from the Encyclopedia Britannica, but when I saw Yaroslav Pelikan's name and E.P. Sanders' name, those are scholarly names. Yaroslav Pelikan's done a lot of historical work. Some of it's, when I first heard him doing an interview on the radio, he was talking about the sects of Christendom that existed and how they developed. But he's done a little bit more with that because he's looked at very, very early followers of Christ too. And so he was part of authoring this. E.P. Sanders wrote Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which is still a classic work in the field. And so, yes, it's the Encyclopedia Britannica, but two incredible scholars wrote the article. It's actually under the section on Jesus, but there's a subsection on the Jewish religion in the first century. And so these two came together for this article. Now let's see what they say. There were naturally variations from the main theme in Jewish Palestine. Now that's an unfortunate choice of words, but it is used in scholarly circles. For example, there were three small but important religious parties that differed from each other in several ways. Now, they're referring to the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, but I took the comment because you can see that there were variations on the main theme. And then the question becomes, how varied are the variations, and how coherent is the main theme, or how together and the same, how homogeneous is the main theme? and the homogeneity is not necessarily all that homogeneous, and the variations are very, very variations. But there's yet another way to validate that there were variations within Judaism, particularly among the first century period, the Second Temple period, where there was an allowance that becomes less later on. If you were to pick up a Christian book distributor's catalog, that's for those people that order books and don't just do the online Amazon thing. You would find mention that there are a lot of actually Christian books being written about Honi the circle drawer, who was a itinerant teacher at the time, and actually Christians have picked up on him, and they like writing about him right now. And I don't know why so much that this has become such a big thing, but there's a few others named in the slide. Interestingly enough, of course, the writers of this article, Yaslav Pelikan and E.P. Sanders, mentioned John the Baptist. Jewish circles today probably wouldn't think of him as being Jewish, but actually he was well within the pale of Judaism in his day. And then you have, and he's actually called an eschatological prophet. You had certain other sages that were around. And then you had the writers of books like the first book of Enoch. And my point is that not only did you have variations in that there were clearly defined sects that varied very much, but you even had itinerant teachers that demonstrated that Judaism was very varied in the Second Temple period. So it wasn't this totally monolithic thing. And I would say that when you take into account the Hasidics of today and the branches of Judaism, it isn't as monolithic as you might think, especially because of Reform Judaism. Now you have Reconstructionist Judaism, and you even have Humanist Judaism. And so Judaism is becoming varied once again to a great deal. So we've ended up discussing that because we need to see that we can view the New Testament as a Jewish document within the fact that there were varieties of Judaism. And so the New Testament, written by or penned by, I'd like to say, the Jewish apostles, can be viewed as a Jewish document because really what we're going to end up seeing is that the faith that we now know as Christianity actually fell within the pale of Judaism, which would indicate that the New Testament, which is a Christian document, is also a very Jewish document, if indeed the faith that came to be known as Christianity fell within the pale of Judaism at the time. Not to mention the nature of the writers' writing. Let's look at these writers just a little bit. Let's look at the practice of the Jewish apostles in the book of Acts. Now I like to go to the book of Acts, and I'll have people say to me that the book of Acts is a transitional book, and so you have to be very careful with it, and I would agree with them. We can't just willy-nilly take from the book of Acts, but on the other hand, we can't ignore the book of Acts. The book of Acts gives us the best snapshot of the early church. When you look at other documents, one, they're not inspired by God. Documents like the Didache are not inspired by God. And so when we look at some of the early church fathers' letters, well, they're all good, but contrary to popular belief, they were not inspired by God. But when we look at the book of Acts, we see what early faith looked like through an inspired document. And so is it possible that the faith in Messiah fell within the pale of Judaism and the New Testament could be viewed as a Jewish document? Well, one, Judaism was varied enough that that's a highly likely possibility. In other words, it wasn't monolithic and a messianic faith was the odd man out. The Judaism of the Second Temple period was very varied, and so it makes perfect sense that if you had Jewish men writing these writings who fell within the pale of Judaism and practiced a Jewish custom and were Jews themselves, that could highly be the case that we should really consider viewing the New Testament as a Jewish document. It would make no sense, and here's the main point: it would make no sense to include the pattern of the Jewish apostles practicing Jewish customs if the New Testament was designed to be a non-Jewish book. So I borrowed from John Fisher, who I've met, and I have his book, The Enduring Paradox, which is actually a bunch of essays, and there are a few contributors. And I'm not going to say that I'm going to say that I agree with everything in every essay in this book, but one of the things he does very well in his section on the practice of the Jewish apostles in Acts is to demonstrate that they did remain Jewish. Now, where you go with that and how rigid and legalistic you get with those practices might be a different question. And what I mean by legalistic is not so much that Jewish believers remain Jewish, but do they do so at a rigidity in which they regard it as merit or absolutely necessary for their sanctification, as opposed to viewing it in terms of identity and witness? And I'm not going to get into that whole argument, but you need to understand that, yes, you can be legalistic with customs. You can be legalistic with Jewish practice. It is possible to do, and it's possible not to do. And so I'm not going to argue the rigidity of the practice or the carefulness of the practice, or to borrow a Yiddish word, how from you have to be. What I am going to state is that the Jewish apostles did, and I'm grateful John Fisher pointed it out, did continue to practice Jewish custom, which would not make sense if it was a bunch of, the New Testament was a non-Jewish book written wholly by Gentiles. So he points out it was the practice at the time for Jesus' followers to go to the temple in Jerusalem for worship and prayer. And he takes two verses. He looks at Acts 2:46 and Acts 3:1. Now, he can't have all the fun here, so we have to look at some verses too, don't we? Okay. So I'm just having a little bit of a problem here all of a sudden. Huh. There we go. Now, look at this. This is Acts 2:46. This is one of the verses that John Fisher points out, and he rightly points it out, and he rightly interprets it. So they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. I want you to notice that they broke bread house to house. I think that's separate worship, where the believers got together separately, and then they got together with other Jewish people for very, very Jewish worship at the Jewish temple. I want you to note that this is after the birth of the church, because someone could say, well, the church had not come into being yet. And so, of course, they were just going to the temple. But you see, at the beginning of Acts 2, you have the birth of the church, and you have Pentecost, and this is afterwards. So you can't use the excuse that the church came into existence later, unless you want to argue that the church comes into existence after Acts 2. Most of the people that I run into that want to argue for the birth of the church other than Acts 2 would argue it existed in some form before. Then there is a weird group that likes to argue later than that, and I'm going to leave them be a weird group, because I don't think you can make a case for it. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, and I like this, I haven't done this to somebody, but if someone came up to me and it was a Jewish non-believer and he said, you're an apostate, I would have to say no. I care to disagree with you. I'm a heretic. Now, I'm being a little cute and a little funny here. But early disputes with the Jewish leadership show that those who followed the faith were still considered part of the pale of Judaism, they were considered heretical. By the way, they were not considered apostate. So I don't buy the excuse that a Jewish believer is apostate. The worst that you could do is make the argument he's heretical. You want to try to make that argument, you go ahead. But I refuse to accept the term apostate because they didn't view themselves as having left biblical faith, and neither do I. And I believe that Yeshua is the epitome of what God intended for Israel. So let's look at the quote. It's still from the writers of the New Testament would hardly have gone to the trouble to demonstrate that the early disputes with Jewish leaders had them considering the Jewish followers of Jesus as practicing a faith they considered Jewish yet heretical if they regarded the New Testament as a non-Jewish book. It would have been really easy for the Jewish leadership to say, hey, look, you're following a non-Jewish religion, give it up. This is a Gentile religion. At no point do the early detractors from the Jewish side of the camp attacking the Jewish followers of Jesus consider themselves anything but Jewish. Now, yes, heretical, but certainly Jewish. Why would the writers of the New Testament make a big point that the early followers of Jesus were still Jewish if they were out to write a non-Jewish book? That's the last thing that you would go ahead and stress. And yet they do go ahead and stress just that. Interestingly enough, John Fisher, again, page 28, in the same chapter, says, during the entire period, I probably should have the word of there, of the settling. I'm sorry, the entire period, the settling was Jerusalem, and the issues were Jewish ones between Jews who believed in Messiah, the Messiah had come, and those who did not. What John's saying is exactly what I said, and the reality is that the writers of the New Testament considered their disputes to be Jewish disputes. Well, they couldn't be writing a non-Jewish book if they considered their disputes to be Jewish disputes. But even more interesting, there were priests who ended up following the faith. Really? Yes. Why would New Testament writers have underscored the fact that Jewish priests came to faith if that points to the Jewishness of the faith and to the Jewishness of the New Testament, unless they expected that the New Testament was not a non-Jewish book? Now, where did I ever get the idea that some of the priests came to believe in Jesus as the Messiah? Well, I get the idea because it's recorded for me by Luke. I should say it's recorded for me by the Holy Spirit through the pen of Luke in Acts 6:7. Then the word of God spread, and the number of disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Well, that's not the thing to include in a non-Jewish book, is it now? Well, what about Paul? One of the messages I hope to tape when I'm out in California is, did Paul invent Christianity? I'm not the first person to deal with this, but I'm certainly going to have a lot of fun dealing with it. It's been a charge for a long time. Did Paul abandon his identity? And I'm sorry about the spelling error. Although he did not, I'm sorry about that. That got skewed. Did not abandon his identity, although he did not want to regulate or impose that identity on the church. Little problem with the PowerPoint showing up the right way. Here's the important point. Yes, Paul did not want to impose Jewish identity on the church as a whole, and he did not want to play junior Holy Spirit and put a bug in every Jewish believer's house to figure out how much they were practicing and not. By the way, that should never be done. If God wanted you to be the Holy Spirit, you would be the Holy Spirit. He doesn't need your help. And if you want to talk about regulating believers in terms of sin, let's deal with the ethical before we start bugging people's house to figure out how tightly they're keeping practice. That sort of behavior is contrary to what should be done. Let's look at Paul, though. Although he does not spy on every Jewish believer or impose Jewish identity on the church as a whole, he does do something. In the latter stages of Paul's career, he continued to identify himself as a Jew who believed in Jesus. I am a Jew in Acts 22:3. I love this. Acts 23:6. He literally uses the Greek present tense, ego eimi pharisaios, I believe is the exact Greek. Ego eimi is present active indicative. What that means is that Paul, who is a believer, who is an apostle, still regarded himself as a Pharisee. In fact, he stated his purpose in going to Jerusalem, Acts 24:11 and 12, was to go up to the temple for the purpose of worship. Does Paul regard himself as a Jew? Yes. He wrote many of the epistles in the New Testament. I should say many is an understatement. Well, if he's writing an anti-Jewish book, the last thing he wants to be doing is talking about being a Pharisee and stating he is a Jew and stating what tribe he's from. He still regarded himself as Jewish. But the book of a Jewish Messiah is naturally Jewish, is it not? Well, Jesus' Jewish lineage is stated in the Gospel to Matthew. Let's see how Jewish Jesus is. Son of David, son of Abraham. Well, you don't get a better pedigree than that. So when someone tells me that Jesus isn't Jewish, that's absurd. By the way, the church ought not ignore that either. If Matthew starts with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham, the church needs to pay attention to the fact that their Lord is Jewish. Now, is he just human? No, he's God. But he didn't shed that genealogy. It was part of who he was in his humanness. The New Testament writers carried on Jesus' message. Jesus' message is regarded by Jesus to be Jewish. So by extension, the New Testament should not be considered a non-Jewish book. Why would the New Testament be a non-Jewish book if Jesus' message is regarded by Jesus as Jewish and the New Testament writers carried on his message? But where did I ever get the idea that Jesus regarded his message as Jewish? John 5:45 and 46, do not think I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed Moses, you would have believed in me, for he wrote of me. Jesus considers his message to be totally in line with the prophets and Moses. Therefore, it is a Jewish by its very nature. And if it is a Jewish message and the New Testament writers are carrying it on, then they're carrying on a Jewish message as they write the New Testament. This is why I believe that knowing the Jewish background is important for the church to better understand the background of their own scriptures. Okay, let's talk about what we've learned today in terms of some general things. First of all, revelation doesn't happen in a vacuum. God does not speak out of nowhere. It's connected to something. And so when we look at a very Jewish message, it's connected to revelation that came before. The New Testament builds upon the Tanakh. And the Tanakh has a whole lot of Jewishness to it. And so the New Testament should have a whole lot of Jewishness to it. And we need to understand that revelation builds on revelation. We also need to understand Romans, where Paul says something very, very important that needs to be understood. And I really want to challenge the church a little bit with this, because lip service is paid to this all too often. So I'm going to Romans, and I'm going to Romans 2. Actually, I'm going to Romans 3. Paul says, "For what advantage has the Jew, or what profits circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God." The Jewish people have been God's channel for giving revelation to humankind. Definitely what is sometimes called the Old Testament or the Tanakh. We can call it the Older Testament because it's a little older. And even the New Testament. So let's put it in a way that's very, very clear. Revelation doesn't come from nowhere. God has revelation built on revelation. And the Jewish people are the channel through which the Bible was given. Is the New Testament a Jewish book? Yes. Written by Jewish apostles, conveying a message that a Jewish Messiah considered to be Jewish, falling within the pale of the variations of Judaism that existed in the Second Temple period, which was not monolithic. And so really, if a Jewish person objects to the New Testament, I wouldn't necessarily start there. I could say, no, the realization is you really need to consider whether you believe in the New Testament or not as being inspired as Jewish literature, as a Jewish book. And until you can read the New Testament for me and show me that it is not a Jewish book, there are solid reasons for believing it is. And you need to consider it Jewish literature at the very least and treat it like that. What I want to deal with next week is that the term Jew is used in a derogatory way in the Gospel of John. And one of the charges against the Gospel of John is that it demonstrates the New Testament's anti-Semitic because it's anti-Semitic because the term Jew is used in some derogatory ways within John. I actually wrote a paper on this when I was in Feinberg, and so I'm going to take you through part of that paper. I said next week. I'm thinking next week, but it may not be next week. So please check in and see if we can end up making this work. Get some things on there, get the other things I need to get done, and still be able to end up doing this. So I speak in hope and in trust there, but realize that things may not work out as I've planned. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of close up. Hopefully you got a lot out of this. First of all, you realize Judaism was varied and that the faith fell within that pale. You realize that the writers of the New Testament did not want to distance themselves and create a non-Jewish book, and you now have a reason why we'll deal with another problematic issue in the near future. I do thank you for being here tonight. Please check out the website, and we're going to see if we can transfer things better. We're still playing around with what the best mediums are. So until you see me again, shalom, shalom.